Vindictus, Defying Fate, is a dark fantasy project from Nexon. While the original redefined physics-based action, this modern take is a massive leap in technical fidelity. Built on Unreal Engine 5, the game focuses on making its world feel uncomfortably real and heavy. The use of lumen in the damp ruins of Ainlay adds a physical weight to the atmosphere that feels remarkably grounded. Beyond just polish, the fluid cloth physics and character shaders give the combat a visceral, deliberate feel that lacks the floatiness of typical MMOs. Seeing a blade interact with dense geometry adds a layer of tangible, physical impact. It's an ambitious, thicker evolution of their formula that's worth watching with some cautious optimism as we wait for real gameplay tests.
I still have no trust in your kind.
ArcheAge Chronicles is basically an attempt to evolve that cult classic sandbox, and they're aiming for a late 2026 release. It's being led by Jake Song, which definitely gives it some weight, but it feels like the game is trying to move away from the usual MMO tropes. Instead of just being another living world with a complex economy, it seems to be focusing more on the actual feeling of being a pioneer in a vast, open space. Technically, the jump to Unreal Engine 5 is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. It's not just about the scale, it's about how thick the world feels. They're using lumen for the lighting, and it actually makes the forests and armor reflections look pretty solid and grounded, but the real shift is in the combat. They're moving away from traditional stat checking and tab targeting towards something more deliberate and action-oriented. It's more about your timing and where you're standing, which makes it feel less like a spreadsheet and more like a proper RPG. The vibe is very much about exploration and pioneering, which sounds good on paper. However, with a Q4 2026 target, we're still a long way off. The main concern is whether they can actually balance that massive scale with this new, tighter combat system, without losing what made the original special. It's definitely ambitious, but as with any big MMO sequel, it's worth keeping a cautious eye on. Project Tal is a new action RPG from the Korean studio Mad Engine, currently aiming for a 2027 release. While they've worked on titles like Night Crows, jumping into the AAA single-player space is a different beast entirely. Technically, the game uses Unreal Engine 5 to create a pretty solid atmosphere, especially with the traditional Tal masks. The way the lighting hits the weathered wood and paint makes the world feel uncomfortably real and grounded. Instead of just flashy effects, it's about the density of the ruins and how particles like snow interact with the massive creatures you're scaling. The combat seems deliberate and heavy, leaning into that visceral, mythological vibe. The main concern is whether a team coming from the MMO space can actually nail the pacing and depth of a cinematic single-player epic. 2027 is still a long way off, so while the aesthetic is fresh, it's worth watching with a healthy dose of skepticism. Instinction is a prehistoric survival project from Hashbane Interactive. Aiming for a late 2026 release on PS5 and PC, they're clearly trying to channel that old Dino Crisis energy, which is a bold move for a relatively new team. Technically, Unreal Engine 5 is doing most of the heavy lifting here, and it looks pretty solid. The lighting in those humid, Mesoamerican jungles feels uncomfortably real and heavy. The way light reflects off wet dinosaur scales is a nice touch, giving the whole thing a grounded, terrifying vibe. The pace seems much more deliberate and slower than your typical shooter. It's all about the tension and the weight of every encounter. The main question is whether a smaller team can actually deliver this level of polish across a full game. It's an ambitious take on survival horror and definitely worth keeping a cautious eye on. Black State is one of those projects that seemingly dropped out of nowhere, claiming to rival the biggest AAA titles. It's being developed by a Turkish studio called Motion Blur, and while they aren't exactly a household name, they've apparently spent 2 decades in the background doing R&D. The game is currently aiming for a late 2026 release on PS5 and PC, and it's definitely trying to make a statement. The standout hook here is the portal-based level transition system. Seeing a character step through a door and instantly end up in a completely different different environment without a loading screen is a cool technical trick. Visually, it's built on Unreal Engine 5.4, and it looks solid. The lighting through Lumen and the reflections on the tactical gear give it a very heavy, grounded atmosphere. Gameplay-wise, it's trying to bridge the gap between the tension of Metal Gear Solid and the kinetic energy of Max Payne. They're promising over 110 unique handcrafted takedowns, which sounds impressive, but the real test will be whether the combat actually feels deliberate, or just becomes a series of repetitive animations. It's a very ambitious pitch for a studio that hasn't put out a major hit yet. With a release date still a couple of years away, it's worth keeping an eye on, but it's probably best to stay cautious until we see how it actually plays. Project Windless is Krafton Montreal's big attempt to adapt the legendary Korean novel The Bird That Drinks Tears, aiming for a 2027 release on PS5 and PC. They've got veteran Patrick Mete leading the studio, which is a solid choice for a Western-style AAA, but it's a hell of a task to translate such a specific, dark fantasy world into a global hit. Technically, it's a major showcase for Unreal Engine 5, and it looks pretty solid. The Reckon, those massive bird-like warriors, have an uncomfortably real look to them, especially the way the feathers and micro-expressions are handled. Using Lumen for lighting makes the jungle environments feel thick and oppressive, adding a lot of physical weight to the atmosphere. It's not just about the visuals, though. The way blood and light interact during those one versus many fights makes the combat feel visceral and heavy. The vibe is uncompromisingly bleak, focusing on deliberate power rather than just flashy combos. The main question is whether they can actually pull off this ambitious cultural bridge by 2027 without losing the soul of the original story. It's definitely worth watching, but as with any massive 2027 project, it's best to stay cautiously optimistic until we see real gameplay.
Let you run just far enough to feel it. You are still on a leash.
Ruiner 2 is the brutal cyberpunk follow-up from Raycon Games, currently aiming for a 2027 release on PC and consoles. While the studio has a solid track record, moving to Unreal Engine 5 is a major technical shift. The visual signature is defined by harsh, crimson-tinted neon, and how Lumen handles lighting in the industrial wastelands of Rengkok. Instead of just flashy effects, there's an uncomfortable realism in the mechanical shell transitions and the dense geometry of the world. Seeing the iconic mask flicker through thick, volumetric smoke adds a tangible, physical presence to the environment that feels much heavier than before. The combat remains surgical and deliberate, but the real test is whether they can maintain that high-speed kinetic energy while leaning into this more grounded, visceral style. 2027 is still a long way off, so while the technical polish looks promising, it's worth watching with a healthy dose of skepticism. Kena Scars of Kosmora is the sequel from Ember Lab, currently aiming for a late 2026 release on PS5 and PC. After the first game, we know this team can deliver that Pixar-style polish, but the real surprise back then was how punishing the combat actually was. For this follow-up, they seem to be leaning into a much more mature and grounded tone. Technically, it's looking like an Unreal Engine 5 project. The lighting in the forests and snowy mountains feels solid. It adds a layer of physical weight to the world, rather than just being flashy. The facial work on an older, more experienced Kena adds some needed gravity to her story. Seeing her ride a massive spirit wolf looks like a cool addition, especially with how the spirit particles react to the environment. The gameplay itself is moving towards something more deliberate, focusing on elemental alchemy and new companions. It feels thicker and more complex than the original, which could be great if the mechanics have enough depth. The only real concern is whether they can balance all these new systems without losing the focused charm of the first game. It's an ambitious jump for the studio, so it's definitely worth watching with some cautious optimism.
always said monsters didn't exist. I thought they lived under my bed. We were both wrong. They live inside our heads.
Hell Is Us has been out since late 2025, and it's still one of the more unique single-player games for 2026. It's the work of Jonathan Jacques Belletet, the guy who basically defined the modern Deus Ex look, so it's definitely got style. But the real shift here isn't just the aesthetic, it's how much the game refuses to hold your hand. There are no waypoints, no map markers, which makes exploring the war-torn country of Hedea feel a bit more real, and honestly, sometimes a bit overwhelming. Technically, it's built on Unreal Engine 5, and it looks pretty solid. The lighting in the foggy forests and the detail in the ruins add a lot of weight to the world. Those weird, hollow-bodied enemies move with an uncanny physics that's actually pretty disturbing to watch. The combat is slow and deliberate, aiming for a grounded feel where every hit counts. It's definitely not for everyone, especially if you're used to games that tell you exactly where to go. The biggest question is whether you have the patience for that organic exploration. If you're into immersive mysteries that don't treat you like a child, it's worth a look, but be prepared for a bit of a learning curve. Kong Survivor Instinct is a 2.5D adventure that's been out since late 2024, and it's a surprisingly solid take on the Monsterverse. 7 levels, the studio behind it, isn't a 3A giant, but they've clearly tried to scale their platforming routes to fit these massive Titan encounters. Technically, the use of Unreal Engine makes the ruined skyscrapers and debris feel pretty heavy and grounded. The lighting and smoke effects add a layer of realism that makes being a human in Kong's world feel uncomfortably small. Instead of a typical action game, it leans into survival and more deliberate movement. The combat is about timing and platforming, rather than just mashing buttons. It's not a massive epic, and the 2.5D perspective might feel a bit niche for some, but if you want a more cinematic, grounded look at the Titans, it's actually worth checking out. War of the Worlds, Siberia, from 1C Game Studios. While the team is famous for the IL-2's Thermovic series, bringing that level of simulation-grade precision to a narrative survival game is a massive technical shift. Built on Unreal Engine 5, the project focuses on making its alternate history invasion feel uncomfortably real. The implementation of Lumen grounds the snowy Siberian landscapes, while the black smoke particle system weaves through the dense geometry of the taiga with a physical presence that adds to the dread. You can really feel the physical weight in the protagonist's movement as he struggles through the mud, making the survival elements feel remarkably tangible rather than just cinematic. The vibe is oppressively grim and grounded, trading typical sci-fi spectacle for a more deliberate, high-stakes survival experience. The real test will be whether a studio known for flight sims can actually nail the pacing of a character-driven action-adventure. It's an ambitious, heavy project, definitely worth watching with some cautious optimism.
We're facing a situation of the utmost delicacy. I need all my pieces on the board.
009 is a master manipulator. Whatever the endgame is, we won't see it coming.
007. First Light is an origin story for Bond, coming from the Hitman devs. And from the look of things, it's aiming for a more grounded and focused experience. It's slated for May 2026, and while it's a multi-platform release, they're definitely pushing the PS5 version as the main technical showcase. We know IO Interactive can build great sandboxes, but they're clearly trying something different here. Instead of just giving us those slow, puzzle-like levels, they're leaning more into momentum and tactical infiltration. The core idea is that you're playing as a spy rather than just an assassin. The focus is on eavesdropping and investigation, which makes every move feel a bit more deliberate. Visually, it looks pretty solid. The trailer showed off some new smoke effects and lighting that add a nice layer of realism to the sleek interiors and rainy streets. The only real question mark right now is whether the game loses some depth because of that shift toward forward momentum. Hitman gave you a massive amount of freedom, and it's not entirely clear yet how much this one might box you in. But if they actually deliver on the espionage systems as promised, it could end up being a pretty fresh take on the genre. Blight Survival is one of those projects that looks almost too good for a small team like Henyer Studio, but it's definitely carving out its own niche in the extraction genre. Slated for late 2026, the game is being developed for multiple platforms, and it's basically becoming a case study for what indies can do with modern tools. While Henyer isn't a big name, their gameplay reveals have been surprisingly polished, often looking more atmospheric than some of the major AAA projects we've seen lately. Technically, it's built on Unreal Engine 5, and they're really leaning into a miserable aesthetic. Using Lumen for the lighting makes the mud-caked medieval landscapes and blood-stained armor look incredibly grounded. Everything feels heavy. The way the wet fabric sways and the grime clings to your gear adds a layer of realism that's actually pretty uncomfortable. The core loop is a punishing medieval extraction experience. The combat is deliberate, where every swing of your sword carries weight and consequence. It's a bleak blend of historical realism and supernatural rot. The main concern is whether such a small studio can actually maintain this level of fidelity across a full game by late 2026. If they can pull it off, it'll be something special. But for now, it's worth staying cautiously optimistic. The Outer Worlds 2 arrived in late 2025. And while Obsidian's reputation for RPGs is solid, moving to a full Unreal Engine 5 project was a massive technical shift for the studio. It's an Xbox and PC exclusive, and the extra polish shows. Instead of the plasticky look of the original, the use of lumen and dense geometry makes these corporate star systems feel uncomfortably real and heavy. The way light hits the polished chrome of security bots adds a physical weight to the environment that feels much more grounded. The satire is still sharp, but the world itself is now more tangible and visceral. Combat is faster, but more deliberate, trading arcade shooting for something more tactical. The main concern remains whether the increased scale affects the tight, choice-driven narrative Obsidian is known for. It's a serious technical leap for the studio, and definitely worth your time. Reanimal is the next dark co-op horror from Tarsier Studios. We've seen what this team can do with the first two Little Nightmares, so they clearly know how to handle atmospheric dread. Technically, the game is built on Unreal Engine 5, and it looks pretty solid. The way lumen lighting interacts with that thick volumetric fog makes the world feel uncomfortably real and heavy. It's not just about flashy graphics. The shadows here feel like they have actual physical weight. The stitched together creatures move with an uncanny, physics-based motion that's genuinely disturbing to watch. The vibe is much more oppressive and grounded than their previous work, focusing on the vulnerability of two siblings. The only real question is how the co-op affects the tension. But for fans of cinematic survival horror, it's definitely worth watching. The Wolf Among Us 2 is currently targeting a 2027 release on all platforms. While Telltale is the master of narrative noir, moving to Unreal Engine 5 is a massive technical shift for them. It gives Fabletown an uncomfortably real, heavy atmosphere with tactile animations. The high contrast shadows on Big B's coat add a physical weight that grounds the entire project. It's definitely worth watching. Blade Runner 2033 Labyrinth is being handled by Annapurna's first internal studio, and after all the recent drama there, it's hard to say exactly when it'll drop. Likely 2026 or 2027. It's aiming for PS5 and PC, and while we don't have a confirmed engine, it's almost certainly Unreal Engine 5. The team is led by Chelsea Hash, who worked on What Remains of Edith Finch, which suggests a heavy focus on narrative over typical action. What really sticks out is how they're using lighting to nail that iconic, rain-soaked neon noir look. It's not just about next-gen visuals, it's about that dense, grimy atmosphere where light flickers through dirty windows. The game follows a detective during the blackout, so the vibe is grounded, and pretty heavy. The only real concern is how the recent studio shakeups might affect the final polish. But if you're into methodical noir stories, it's definitely worth keeping on your radar. Replaced from Sad Cat Studios is currently aiming for a late 2026 release. While the project has faced several delays, the technical polish shown in the teasers suggests they're trying to push the indie space into much heavier territory. Technically, the game blends high-end 3D depth with pixel art, and the result feels uncomfortably real for a 2.5D world. The way volumetric fog catches the neon glows adds a lot of physical weight to this decaying setting. Between the rotoscoped animations and physics-driven reflections on wet pavement, the environment feels remarkably tactile and grounded. The real question is whether the gameplay can actually match this insane level of visual fidelity after such a long wait. It's a bleak, ambitious project that's definitely worth watching, but keep your expectations in check. Phantom Blade Zero is an action RPG aiming for a late 2026 release on PS5 and PC, and it's being pitched as Kung Fu Punk. While that sounds like a marketing buzzword, S-Game is actually trying to bridge the gap between cinematic movie choreography and interactive gameplay. They've even brought in Kenji Tanigaki to help with the moves, so the combat looks incredibly smooth. Technically, the game is built on Unreal Engine 5, and the rain-slicked ancient ruins look solid. The lighting through the heavy mist adds a lot of physical weight to the atmosphere. What really stands out isn't just the flashy animations, but the weight of the weapon collisions. Seeing actual scratches form on polished steel when blades clash makes the combat feel uncomfortably physical and grounded. Everything has this heavy, momentum-based feel, where every strike seems to have real consequences. It's a bleak, oppressive world, but the movement itself is surgical and fast. The only real concern here is whether a smaller studio can actually maintain this level of technical fidelity across the entire game. It's an ambitious project, and if the combat feels as good as it looks, it'll be a standout. But for now, it's worth keeping a cautious eye on. Intergalactic, the Heretic Prophet, is Naughty Dog's next big bet, currently aiming for a mid-2027 release as a PS5 exclusive. This is their first completely new IP in over a decade, so there's a lot of pressure on them to deliver something beyond the usual Uncharted or The Last of Us formula. From the look of things, they're moving toward a philosophical space opera that feels surprisingly grounded for the genre. Technically, their proprietary engine is doing a lot to make the alien world of Siberia look uncomfortably real. It's not just the character faces, but the tactile feel of retro tech, like Sony CD players and Porsche-designed ships that give the setting its weight. The combat seems to focus more on visceral melee against robots, which suggests a shift toward a heavier, more deliberate style of interaction. It's a weird but solid blend of high-fidelity sci-fi and 80s aesthetic. The real question is whether Naughty Dog can maintain their signature intimate storytelling in such a vast alien environment without it feeling too detached. With a 2027 date, there's still plenty of room for shifts. So while the 80s in space vibe is definitely interesting, it's worth keeping a cautious eye on how it actually plays out. The first Berserker, Khazan, from Neapel, arrived in March 2025, marking a huge shift for the Dungeon and Fighter creators as they moved into high-fidelity 3D. While they're masters of the side-scrolling genre, this transition was a massive technical leap that actually feels earned. Technically, the game uses Unreal Engine to blend a sharp anime aesthetic with a physical, grounded weight. The real hook is how the stylized lighting interacts with the dense, snow-covered geometry of the Pel Talos Empire. There's an uncomfortable realism in the way Khazan moves. His greatsword swings have a tangible momentum that makes the combat feel much heavier than your typical anime-style action game. The ink-like blood splatters and crimson particles add a visceral layer to the environment that feels physically present rather than just painted on. The vibe is hauntingly dark and unapologetically punishing. The main question remains whether this hardcore difficulty curve works for everyone, but as a technical benchmark for heavy, tactical action RPGs, it's a solid project that avoids the floaty feel common in the genre. Crimson Desert finally arrived this March, and it's a massive single-player shift for Pearl Abyss. They've spent years on their own black space engine, and it shows. The world of Pywell feels uncomfortably real. Instead of just flashy lighting, the real hook is the physical detail, like how snow actually settles on surfaces, or the heavy sway of a fur cloak. It gives the environment a solid, grounded weight. That's rare for the genre. The combat follows suit. It's deliberate and visceral, moving away from that floaty, weightless action common in big RPGs. It's more about the impact and timing than just spamming skills. The only real question is whether the performance stays consistent across such a huge map. If you're looking for an immersive epic that prioritizes atmosphere over the usual MMO-style grind, this one is definitely worth checking out. Exodus is the debut sci-fi epic from Archetype Entertainment. And even though the studio is a new name, it's led by BioWare veterans who basically defined the golden era of RPGs. There's real weight behind this one. From what we've seen, the game is trying to fill that space opera void, but with a much heavier, more emotional tone than your average sci-fi adventure. Technically, it's a flagship showcase for Unreal Engine 5, and it looks solid. Instead of just focusing on flashy combat, the devs are putting massive effort into facial animations. This is key, because the main hook here is time dilation. The idea that while you're out exploring alien megastructures, decades are passing for everyone back home. The interaction between Lumen's lighting and these massive environments creates a vibe that feels physically tangible. The starship combat looks polished, but the real test is whether the narrative can actually live up to that old BioWare magic. The obvious downside is that 2027 is still a long way off. It's an ambitious jump for a new studio, and while the time as an enemy concept sounds great, we need to see how it actually plays. Definitely worth watching, but stay cautiously optimistic.
Pressure there.
Tomb Raider Legacy of Atlantis is the next major step for Lara Croft, currently slated for a 2026 release on PS5, Xbox, and PC. This collaboration between Crystal Dynamics and Flying Wild Hog is an interesting pivot, merging traditional narrative roots with high-octane action expertise. While the reboot trilogy redefined Lara, this new entry feels like a much more grounded and heavy take on the franchise. Technically, the project is a flagship for Unreal Engine 5, and it looks pretty solid. The implementation of Lumen grounds those damp, subterranean caves with an uncomfortable realism. The use of nanite for the ancient Atlantean ruins adds a layer of dense geometry that makes the environments feel truly massive and physical rather than just background art. Seeing the ray-traced glint on the iconic twin pistols adds a tactile, almost startling authenticity to the frame. The combat appears more deliberate and visceral, moving away from the more arcadey feel of previous entries. The main question is whether this darker, more oppressive vibe can still capture the sense of adventure the series is known for. It's an ambitious technical benchmark, and definitely worth watching with a healthy dose of skepticism. Gears of War E-Day is the Coalition's attempt to bring the series back to its roots. Aiming for a 2026 release on Xbox and PC, the studio has a solid track record with Unreal Engine, but this time, they're moving away from the heroic spectacle of recent entries. Instead, they're leaning into a darker, horror-inspired vibe that feels much more grounded. Technically, it's a big push for Unreal Engine 5. The detail on a younger Marcus Phoenix looks genuinely solid, especially the facial work and how lumen lighting hits those crumbling interiors. The environmental destruction adds a lot of physical weight to the combat, making every tackle feel more impactful. The real question is whether this back-to-basics survival approach will actually keep the gameplay fresh. It's an ambitious pivot toward a more visceral, tactical experience. Definitely worth watching, though we'll have to see if the pacing actually holds up. Gothic 1 Remake is finally hitting consoles and PC on June 5th, 2026. It's being handled by Alchemia Interactive, a studio THQ Nordic basically built from the ground up just for this project. While they've gathered veterans to protect the series' unique DNA, remaking a cult classic like this is always a massive gamble. From what we've seen, the jump to Unreal Engine 5 is doing a lot to keep that original grim atmosphere alive. The way Lumen handles dynamic lighting in places like the old mine makes the environment feel uncomfortably real and claustrophobic. Instead of just a next-gen coat of paint, it feels like they're trying to make the world itself more oppressive and physically tangible. Visually, the ray-traced reflections on guard armor and the facial animations for characters like Diego look solid, but the real test is the gameplay. Gothic was always known for being notoriously punishing, and it seems like they're sticking to that sink-or-swim mentality. The combat feels heavy and deliberate, which might turn off players used to modern, floaty RPGs, but that's exactly what the core fans expect. The main concern is whether they can polish the original's jank without losing its soul. If you like dark, uncompromising RPGs, it's worth watching, but keep your expectations in check. The Fable reboot from Playground Games hits Xbox and PC this autumn. While they're Forza experts, moving to an RPG is a massive leap. Using the Forza Tech engine makes Albion look surprisingly grounded and heavy. With solid facial tech, it's got that tactile, physical feel where every expression carries weight. The real question is whether a racing studio can actually deliver a deep narrative. It's an ambitious shift, but definitely worth watching with some caution.
And my only way out of here is with one of them.
Judas is the next big project from Ken Levine, slated for 2027 on PS5, Xbox, and PC. While we know Levine can deliver deep philosophical stories like BioShock, this narrative Lego experiment feels like a huge gamble for Ghost Story games. Technically, it's built on Unreal Engine 5, and it looks pretty solid. The neon-lit halls of the Mayflower starship have a nice, heavy atmosphere. The way Lumen handles lighting and the disintegration of the environment adds a layer of physical weight to the action. Combat is fast, but feels more deliberate, especially with those elemental powers reacting to the world around you. The real test is whether these complex story systems actually work, or just get in the way. It's a promising immersive sim, but with a 2027 date, it's best to stay cautiously optimistic. Light No Fire is the next massive project from Hello Games. We've seen what they did with No Man's Sky, but building an entire Earth-sized fantasy planet is a whole new level of ambition. Instead of infinite space, they're focusing on one massive procedural world without any loading screens. Technically, it looks pretty solid. The volumetric clouds and the way light hits those bioluminescent oceans give it a heavy, grounded atmosphere. You can actually feel the physical weight of the water when you dive, making the survival elements feel less like an arcade game and more like a proper exploration experience. The real question is whether they can actually fill a world that big with enough variety to keep it from feeling empty after the first few hours. It's an incredibly ambitious setup, but it's definitely worth watching with some cautious optimism. Control Resonant is Remedy's next big push into their connected universe, and it's currently aiming for a 2026 release across all major platforms. We generally know what to expect from this studio after Alan Wake 2. They've basically become the go-to for cinematic, weird stories. But with this sequel, the real question is whether they can actually evolve the formula, or if it's just a prettier version of the first Control. Technically, they're still using their Northlight engine, and the path tracing on that brutalist concrete looks pretty solid. It's got that heavy, grounded feel, where the light and shifting walls make the environment look almost uncomfortably real. The facial animations and physics-based destruction seem to have more weight now, making the chaotic office environments feel a bit more physical. The combat is still fast, but it's trying to stay thick, giving those telekinetic powers a real sense of mass. It's definitely a sensory experience, blending an alien vibe with a very tangible world. The only real concern is if the Remedy-verse is becoming too dense for its own good. If they can keep the weirdness focused, it should be a solid follow-up, but it's worth keeping a cautious eye on the scale. Marvel's Wolverine is finally hitting the PS5 on September 15th, 2026. And it looks like Insomniac is trying to step away from the flashy, acrobatic style of Spider-Man for something much darker. We know they can handle technical benchmarks, but making a visceral, R-rated action game is a different kind of challenge. Technically, they're using an evolved version of their own engine, and the detail on Logan's face and clothes feels uncomfortably real and grounded. The standout feature is definitely the adamantium claws. The way they've used ray tracing on the metal and how it interacts with the environment looks pretty solid. The combat seems to have a real sense of resistance when you're slicing through enemies, making every hit feel heavy and deliberate rather than just mindless button mashing. It's definitely aiming for a gritty, thicker vibe where the gore and the impact actually mean something. The only real question is whether they can balance this slower, more punishing pace with the high-speed action fans might expect from the studio. It's an ambitious pivot toward a more mature experience, and definitely worth watching, but we'll have to see if the gameplay loop stays fresh. Silksong finally dropped in late 2025, and after years of waiting, it's clear Team Cherry was aiming for something much faster and more complex than the original. It's out on all platforms, and while they're still sticking with Unity, the hand-drawn detail in Farloom feels a lot more dense and layered this time around. The parallax effects give the world a massive sense of scale, and the way the silk particles and Hornet's cloak move adds a bit of physical weight to the 2D space. The combat is much more surgical and vertical, compared to the Knight's slower, more methodical pace. It feels heavy, but agile. It's all about constant momentum, rather than just staying grounded. The only real question is whether the increased speed and complexity lose some of that lonely, atmospheric simplicity that made the first game so special. It's definitely a new benchmark for the genre, but it's a different beast entirely from what we're used to. GTA 6 is finally arriving on November 19th, 2026. Rockstar has a massive reputation to uphold after Red Dead 2, and they're clearly pushing their Rage engine to its absolute limits. What stands out isn't just the neon-lit streets, but the sheer density of the crowds and the physical realism of things like cloth and skin shaders. It's a huge step up in social simulation, where even ray-traced reflections on car paint feel uncomfortably real. The vibe is still chaotic satire, but the movement looks much heavier and more deliberate. It feels like they're trading arcade-style controls for something more tactical and grounded. The real test will be whether the consoles can actually maintain this level of detail without performance hits. It's an ambitious leap, and while the visual mastery is obvious, we'll have to see if the increased realism makes the game feel a bit too sluggish for some. Mass Effect Next is BioWare's big attempt to reclaim the stars, currently aiming for a late 2027 release across all platforms. We know they're the original architects of the sci-fi RPG, but after some rocky years, there's a fair bit of pressure on this one. Technically, they've switched to Unreal Engine 5, and it looks pretty solid. The lighting through Lumen creates a much more mature, grounded atmosphere. Seeing Geth silhouettes in the distance adds a haunting vibe to the dense alien landscapes. The real question is whether BioWare can still deliver that character-driven magic in such a massive, high-fidelity world. It's an ambitious space opera, definitely worth watching, but we're keeping a cautious eye on the development.
Back to the village. Go, now.
Nay! I must save them! Save the village!
Save yourself!
The Witcher 4, codenamed Project Polaris, is CD Projekt Red's next massive undertaking. While their history with The Witcher 3 is legendary, this project marks a huge technical shift as they abandon their own Red engine for Unreal Engine 5. It's an ambitious move. The use of Lumen and Nanite makes the harsh, winter-stricken environments look uncomfortably real and heavy. Instead of just backdrops, the mountain ranges now have a dense geometry that feels physically tangible. The detail on Ciri's weathered gear and the ray tracing on the new Link's medallion add a layer of visceral immersion that feels remarkably grounded. Combat appears more deliberate and thick, moving away from floaty animations towards something more substantial. The vibe is hauntingly dark, focusing on the raw weight of the world. With such a massive engine transition, it's worth watching with some cautious optimism. It's a technical benchmark in the making, but one that requires a healthy dose of skepticism until we see real, unscripted gameplay.
35 games is just the tip of the iceberg.
My list is done, now it's your turn. Drop your top 3 in the comments below. I'm heading there right now to see what caught your eye and debate the rankings. But don't go anywhere just yet. Right here on your screen are 2 videos I've crafted specifically for those seeking something deeper. Subscribe and pick one. Click it and I'll see you there.